75 years ago, as war raged in Europe and Japan, delegates from all over the world gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to build a new global financial system. Through their creativity and collaboration, billions were lifted out of poverty all over the world, and the American middle class was created. But nearly a century later, it's time to recognize that the global economy has changed. We need a new system, one that builds on what worked, free markets and free people, and changes what doesn't. We need a new path for the future of capitalism, so countries can heal fractures within their own economies. From excessive inequality to job loss from technology, we need to win the race for the future of money. The rise of digital currencies, the long-term health of the euro and the dollar. We need to harness all the tools of economic statecraft, from using sanctions and trade policy wisely to reining in financial crime. Most of all, we need to remember what they knew in 1945. Economics, finance, and foreign policy are all part of the same story. This is a time to restore and rebuild America's collaborative economic leadership. This is a time for GeoEconomics.
Well, good morning. I'm Josh Lipsky, the director of the GeoEconomics Center here at the Atlantic Council. And it's really a pleasure and an honor to welcome everyone for today's conversation on how the pandemic is disrupting global trade, the effects on the global economic recovery, and the lessons we can all learn moving forward. Now, of course, this is a topic that's been front and center of the news over the past week, as we've seen the evolving situation in the Suez. And that's rightfully so. Over 13% of world trade flows through the Suez. But it's something we've been focused on at the Atlantic Council long before the current crisis, and really something we've been talking about the entire past year during the course of the pandemic. We know that global shipping is under strain, supply strains have been stretched thin, sometimes even broken, ports have been overwhelmed, and more broadly, the nature of global commerce is changing with the rise of trade in services versus trade in goods. So this is something that predates what happened in Suez and will outlast what happened in Suez. And that's really what we want to talk about today. So to understand the implications of this, we've assembled really an expert panel. We've brought folks together with public sector experience, private sector experience, leaders in the industry, folks who have been working very hard, especially the past week with this evolving crisis. So we're grateful for their time. And what we want to talk about today is not just what's going to happen in 2021 with global trade, but what's going to happen in the coming years? What's going to be the evolving nature of global trade? What is the US and European role in that process? So that's the conversation we're excited to have. I want to thank everyone at the GeoEconomics Center who helped put this together, Associate Director Ole Moore. I want to thank our supporters at the Council, board members Kostas Krantazopoulos, Chairman of the Atlantic Council, John Rogers. One logistical note, please use the Q&A function in the Zoom chat to put your questions. We're going to try to get to as many as possible today. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator who will take us through our panel, Kostas Paris, a 20-year veteran in the Wall Street Journal who covers trade and supply chains and logistics. So he's been also very busy this week and we're grateful for his time. Kostas, over to you.
Thank you, Josh. It's a pleasure to be part of this event. It has so many distinguished guests. We are just a few, but we are still into the Suez Canal choke with a ship being stuck there. I think this is going to be a quite interesting discussion. So let me introduce our panel. Let me start with Chris Rogers. Chris is a trade supply chains contributor for S&P Global Market Intelligence, and his research covers international trade policy, logistics trends, and an analysis of industrial supply chain. Previously, Chris worked as an international trade analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence after spending about 20 years covering the global supply industry as a sell-side analyst for institutions, including JP Morgan. Hi, Chris.
Hey there.
Our second, let me move on to Penelope Das. She is the president of International Public Affairs and Sustainability for UPS, United Parcel Service, and the movement of cargo from ships to plane has been increasing over the last months. And Penny, I'm sure, will give us some good insights. Moving on, Barbara Matthews, she is the chief executive of BSM Strategy and a senior fellow at the GeoEconomics Center of the Atlantic Council. And Barbara is a managing director and founder of BSM International Regulatory Analytics that focuses on using data and analysis to craft public policy through a patented process, including NLP and ML technology. There has been a number of events, and we all know about the problems with crew changes. Barbara, I think, will provide us with some very, very useful insights. Josh, do we kick it off? All right.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Thank you. Let me start with my first question, which of course has to do with the blockade of the Suez Canal. It's a week before the Evergreen ship was unlodged. And everyone in the industry, supply chain, shipping, argue that this is going to exacerbate the situation, the situation of congestion issues at ports around the world, and further delay cargo deliveries. As a follow-up, there has been also a lot of thoughts and some criticism about how safe are ultra-large container ships, especially those which are 18,000 containers and more, to transit narrow waterways like the Suez. So maybe Chris, can we, let's start with you.
Yeah, sure. Well, firstly, thanks for that, Kostas, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for having us along. So I think when it comes to the Suez blockage specifically, clearly they couldn't have come at a worse time for the global logistics industry. We've shown repeatedly in our research that since August of last year, there's been a significant surge in global trade, largely driven by consumer goods. So it's the stay at home. I have a lovely shiny new monitor in front of me that will have been shipped from China to the United Kingdom. And there's been a continuing growth in that. And that led to congestion in most of the major seaports, both in Western Europe and in the United States, the big consumption centers. At the same time, the ports have been trying to work through that. We end up with this blockage in the Suez Canal. When we think about the markets that will have an effect on, you can split them into three broad areas. Firstly, Asia to Europe, and pretty much everything that goes from Asia to Europe that's containerized is carried through the Suez Canal. So, there's a significant impact coming. Clearly, some of the Western European ports will have a few days to work through the existing backlog that they've got, but then they're going to very rapidly have a whole load of boats arrive that don't just need to be emptied, but that also need to be refilled, of course. And it's notable that some of the container lines, including Hapag-Lloyd, are putting limitations on when containers can be delivered into European ports for export back to Asia. And that's the second big market. That's the products produced in Europe, particularly intermediate capital goods produced in places like Germany, that are going to be shipped back to Asia. So you've already got, not just a 1 week delay of products arriving from Asia to Europe, but then that return journey that could be, delayed a lot more than that. The network effects or the ripple effects that have been referred to by a lot of commentators will take a long time to work through. The third market is the US East Coast, and that flows principally from Southern Asia. So that flows from India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and the Middle East. And those routes will be slowed down. That includes oil shipments as well as consumer goods across a lot of different industries, but primarily consumer goods on that routing as well. So, to a certain extent, when it comes to the Suez Canal issue specifically, there's something for everybody to worry about that. When we think about the safety or otherwise of the vessels, to touch on that broadly, I would say that it's worth bearing in mind that the Suez Canal blockage is just one of many challenges that the large container ships have faced recently. Another major one has been the loss of containers at sea. We've seen 5 major instances of containers being lost at sea at the beginning of this year. Is that because of the way boats are loaded? We don't know, but it's only happening to the biggest boats in the biggest storms. And without getting into the hydrodynamics of it and so on, there are concerns about the speed the boats are being run at and the degree to which they're being filled, whilst this demand is here to get as much shipping done as possible. It's also worth casting your mind back to the beginning of 2019, and throughout 2019, there were a number of onboard vessel fires that occurred, not just in container ships, but there were issues there as well. And of course, as you discussed, the whole issue of actually unloading these things at the ports as well. We wrote some analysis just in the past day or so that showed that the port of Long Beach, 60% of volumes offloaded in the fourth quarter of 2020 were very large or ultra large container ships, so 10,000 TEUs or above. In the prior part of 2020, that had only been 46%, and it had been even lower than that in 2019. So when you look at where the big boats are arriving, they're arriving at the biggest ports and causing the biggest congestion. So LA, Long Beach, and New York in the United States. And it's not like there haven't been similar problems at the Asian loading ports as well. So, I think the container companies are doing the best they can to get the goods where they need to go. They're doing the best they can to operate safely. But in the same way that now is a good time for companies to think about how their supply chains are running after the pandemic, it's a good time for the container lines and other shipping companies to think about how they're organizing and running their networks in light of all the challenges that have been faced recently.
Thanks, Chris. Before we go on, let me just introduce another panelist. It's Megan Green, who is a senior fellow. Hi, Megan, a senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. Megan currently serves as a senior fellow at the Mossavar Rohbani Center for Business and Government at Harvard Kennedy School. She's also the first done Julius Senior Fellow in International Economics at Chatham House. I want to welcome her. And so to follow up Chris's thoughts, I'd like to ask the other panelists if we can start with you, Penny, to talk to us a little bit again about the supply chain issues and how much do you see? How much cargo do you see moving by air now compared with the past, and how much and what does this mean for the supply chain? What does this mean for freight forwarders and the end consumers that will have to pay the higher transportation air costs?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And I think Chris covered a lot of great points that are just as equally important in the air cargo or the aviation industry today as in the shipping industry. there's a lot going on that's really changing the dynamics of the industry, excuse me, very quickly. And so, number one, and I think Chris referenced this, was these massive shifts in consumer spending that have taken place, as well as business. I would throw in the business side of that as well. We've just seen massive shifts in the past year and a half in terms of some of the sourcing and shifts. And at the same time, you're dealing with a relatively static industry in that capacity is normally limited. You're dealing with the universe, the capacity you have to try to move things around the world at that particular moment, and adding capacity is almost impossible in quick conditions. At the same time, what we've seen in the aviation industry is we've lost about half of our air cargo capacity with the passenger airlines. Most of that, a big chunk of what moved around the world moved in the bellies of passenger aircraft. And with that coming offline, you had these extreme demand shocks coupled with some extreme supply shocks during the past year. And I think you've seen some similar things with spot rates. You've seen some similar things with bookings with regards to both air cargo as well as with shipping. And I think all this points to a couple of larger trends that we need to keep in mind, one of which is speed. And so how do you deal with industries that do long-term planning and need long-term planning for stability in terms of movements, yet things are moving today, and consumer demand and industries are pushing at a pace that's extremely quick. That also has climate implications, because when you move things quickly or when you move things at a moment's notice, you have to take into account the impacts of that versus using other modals, maybe less carbon intensive modes. The second thing is digitalization, and there's quite a bit going on in that space. But when you have some of these investments that are taking place over very long periods of time, it takes a while for the digitalization to catch up. So the last point I would make with regards to where things are going with supply chains is the very human impact of what's still going on out there, which is that we still have COVID and staffing is still down, and it's still incredibly hard to move maritime crew, air crew, and others around the world because of COVID. And that's creating an additional shock on the labor side that we're all having to deal with and grapple with. And that then plays into supply chains and how supply chains can need to be planned and react with regards to how the industry is currently, some of the things that we're currently grappling with in the industry. Thank you.
Thanks. Megan, can I come to you and ask one question that I also see from our attendees? How do governments, how do finance ministers, how do trade executives, and of course, transportation sector, the transportation sector, treat all this? Is there, with all the supply chain, there has been increased talk, a lot of talk of diversifying production away from China. It started with a pandemic. We need more masks. We couldn't find masks. We couldn't find sanitizer. So we have to produce these things locally, and not only these things. When China opened up, all these things were forgotten or are getting forgotten quite fast. Globalization has been probably here to stay. China is still the most efficient production center in the world, and the most, and makes sense as far as cost is the most cost effective. Is anything going to change in those supply chains or not?
Yeah, so I guess I would say this debate started long before COVID, long before the Suez Canal got blocked. And we had this debate after 9/11. We had it after the global financial crisis. There was a threat with volcanoes in Iceland, Fukushima melting down, Brexit, Trump. So this is a debate we keep having because there is a balance between efficiency on the one hand and resilience on the other. And so we've now seen that there are real vulnerabilities that come out when you have these kind of choke points that emerge. And there's no way to get rid of the choke points entirely without increasing your costs significantly. So we've seen that globalization started receding long before COVID hit us, but globalization probably is here to stay. And I think the stress really isn't on localization of supply chains necessarily. I think it's on diversity of supply chains. So what we've seen is that we had a much more global supply chain coming into the coronavirus crisis, but also there was significant market concentration around a number of those things. Chips, for example, right now are produced primarily by one company in Taiwan, which it's a choke point economically, but also politically at the moment. So there are these vulnerabilities that I think we now realize we need to probably address. I think Japan, actually, after the meltdown of Fukushima, and the natural disaster they had in quick succession, is probably a good lesson for many of us, because Japan now isn't seeing its prices spike, much to their dismay in some ways, because they wouldn't mind a little inflation, but they're not seeing the kinds of disruptions that we're seeing in the West. And I think it may have been because of lessons learned back after Fukushima melted down. And I think there are a few things Japan has done that might help with resiliency, but that doesn't increase costs prohibitively for Japanese companies. One is they have much tighter relationships with suppliers, so they get sort of more insight on shortages faster. So that's a piece, I think, of the puzzle. And secondly, their inventory to sales ratios are higher than ours in the West, certainly in the US and also in Europe. And so that increases costs a little bit, but seems to have helped Japan weather this storm a little bit better than the rest of us. So I don't buy the argument that globalization is dead, because that hot take comes out after every choke point comes out. But I do think we are thinking about how to diversify our supply chains, if not to onshore specifically and to completely localize supply chains. I do think global supply chains are here to stay. I'd also say industrial policy is popular now. It's popular across the political spectrum in the US, which it hasn't been for a long time. It's certainly emerged in Europe as well. And so I think industrial policy is a piece of this that's going to be with us for a while. I'll leave it there.
Very interesting, Megan. Thank you. If I can move on with one question to Barbara. There's been a long effort for the past 2 or 3 years about the digitization of the supply chain. Everything from the idea of open platforms where every party which is participating, whether it's a ship, where it's cargoed, or customs offices, port officials, they have an open platform with a click of a button on their mobile phone or their laptops, and this would certainly move things forward. There would be less custom checks. There would be less problems changing crews. The cargo would move forward far more efficiently. I wanted to ask, Barbara authored a study to that effect last year. And I wanted to, my question would be, how far are we from having this platform, this digitized platform, where everyone can participate, and whether there is issues like trust? I mean, can you put all these things out in the open, right? Do all the participants trust each other? These issues have been raised.
Thank you, Costas, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting this important discussion and for having me participate. Costas, you're right. The perfection is not attainable, and the race to lower latency and increase efficiencies, as well as security in the supply chain transaction system, has, like Megan said, on other issues, this predates the pandemic. How close are we? Well, I'm confident Penny could talk about all of the ways that UPS and everyone else in the industry, Chris could talk about it in the shipping space. Much of it already is digitized. Much more will be digitized. The WTO yesterday hosted a session on the use of blockchain, which goes very much to the issue of trust in the sense that one can automate the verification process, the authentication process, and deliver significant operational efficiencies automatically through the technology. And the paper I wrote for the Atlantic Council last year really focused on some easy, pragmatic shifts that work with the grain of existing activity to deliver improvements in the supply chain cost, efficiency, and security. However, there are bigger issues as well. So if you think about the blockchain, if you think about the fact that we live in a distributed age, the diversification of supply chains, the resilience of a supply chain is profoundly distributed. And this can generate significant economic growth for countries around the world, both through FDI and the creation of additional production capacity, and through more efficient trade facilitation, which, by the way, started after the Great Financial Crisis, can increase the nimbleness of shifts in shipping. All of these are very positive developments that tend to get overlooked when some big crisis occurs. And one could think about the vulnerabilities. I prefer to think about the opportunity. So the technology makes it possible to shift on a dime when necessary. It also makes it possible to distribute the economic gains and the economic interrelationships between sovereigns, which is the very foundation of the Bretton Woods system. And as a member of the Bretton Woods Committee, I believe strongly that we are all better off and we all grow better when we engage together in international commerce rather than aim toward autarkic economies that seek to develop everything domestically. That's not efficient and it doesn't generate growth globally. And I think it's very important to think about the interconnections and the positive components of interconnections. The last element of that, which Penny mentioned, which I really think is important to underscore, is the people. So whether you want to think about it as a workplace safety issue or whether you want to think about it as an efficiency issue, the health measures associated with protecting the people that work in the supply chain from the factory to the ports is crucially important to keeping the system functioning as well. And I think a lot of companies have been doing a lot of work on that in the last year. We're far from done, but it is. If you think about the massive explosion in consumerism and volumes, and you think about how the port workers and how the aviation workers have been managing, it's very impressive. And I think we should recognize the successes as well as identify vulnerabilities.
Thanks, Barbara. I want to follow up on this. This is going to be my last question before we take questions from our audience. Just to follow up on this, port workers, sailors, people on the front line that deliver with the aviation industry. There's been incredible problems. Hundreds of thousands of seafarers are still stuck in ships, even to this day. I think it's only Singapore that has some kind of efficient way to replace crews. And other hundreds of other thousands are waiting for work that can't travel. Would digitization help with this issue? I think that we are still far away with it, and what other remedies are there out there to address this? Can I start with Chris on this?
Yeah, sure. So will digitization help the plight of sailors and stevedores and so on? The answer is no. It's not. The issue there is government willingness to allow people to travel in time of national or international emergency. The sailors haven't been held up because some computer system didn't know where to send them. It was held up because of countries, governments following their national interest. We're technology optimists here at S&P Global Panjiva, but there's some things that just can't be done. For example, we're concerned about the single user threat scenario for blockchain. It's a secure ledger, but the users are not secure, for example. A dispatch system for sailors can help improve things, but it doesn't change the fact that at some stage, somebody's got to steer a boat and somebody's got to lift a box. And governments together have got to do better. I think it's incumbent on the International Maritime Organization and the other multilaterals to make sure that we learn the lessons and frankly put, just do it better next time. Where technology can help, and this isn't digitization, where technology can help is through automation. That's automation of ports, which I know is deeply unpopular with unions, as you would expect. It's not without its risks. We've seen the new software system at Felixstowe cause significant trouble with operating that port. But automation is an area. Autonomous ships, whilst you wouldn't necessarily want an 18,000 TEU container ship to be running at sea without anybody on board, I think for shorter haul feeder routes, it's certainly possible. And for onward distribution, it's certainly possible as well. I know a lot of the freight forwarding firms and the 3PLs like UPS are pursuing these technologies as well to reduce the human risk inherent in the logistics industry. And of course, it's a good efficiency measure as well.
Megan, how serious do government, financial institutions, banks, and other investors take this digitization drive in the supply chain that Barbara and Chris mentioned? How much money is there actually going in support? Do this projects have, right, from politicians that are basically looking 2, 3, 4 years down the line? That's basically what, that's the horizon that they're looking, not much further. While this digitization drive, especially for the supply chain, is expensive and it's going to take years. It's going to be an ongoing process, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think the digitization certainly helps both efficiency and resiliency. So I mentioned that usually that's a trade-off, but here digitization can help with both. But to Chris's point about the automation side of that, I think, it depends on the country. So, it depends on how many workers are actually looped into that supply chain, how much of your workforce that is. But these kinds of jobs tend to be high wage, high hour jobs, goods producing jobs. They're very worker intensive, a lot of them. And so if we are automating a whole bunch of these jobs away, we're getting rid of exactly the kinds of jobs that we actually really want to be creating. In an era when we are mostly creating services producing jobs, because of course we mostly consume services these days, and services producing jobs tend to be really low hour, low wage jobs. So this feeds into a much bigger problem in the developed world, at least about our labor force and what kind of jobs we're creating. And this is a good example of the kinds of jobs we want to have, and we're automating them all away.
Eddie, can you tell us a little bit about how the air freight, the aviation sector is looking at the digitization process? You guys are extremely busy with the distribution of vaccines. I'm sure that you have developed processes to speed up this digitized process to speed up the distribution. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. So if I could, though, I'd like to start with the people because I think, as Barbara rightly noted, we have had phenomenal dedication by our pilots for the past year and many, many others of our frontline workers. But for today's purposes, I want to just talk about our pilots, which in the sense that when you think about goods moving around the world, it's people also moving. And we've been in a period where we have not had consistent rules globally. And so our pilots, and the rules can change at a moment's notice due to pandemic conditions. And it's been very, very challenging for our pilots and to move around the world and to go through different processes and procedures with constant changes. And it's something that I think is really important from a safety perspective that sometimes gets lost. Our pilots fly in, are locked in hotel rooms. They have food delivered to the door. They're not allowed to leave, and then until their flights. And it's a real challenge, and it's one that I think I'd love to see a Bretton Woods for the movement of essential workers at some point in the future, because all of this stuff moves because of people, and it will for a long time. And I just think that it's an incredibly important point that gets sometimes a bit lost. And our folks have been the ones that have been having to navigate all of this for the past year plus. And they've been extraordinary in their dedication to helping move all of these goods for everybody around the world. Now, on the digitalization front, the point I would just say is that I think there's a lot going on there, and I'd love to build on the point about, if you think about the infrastructure package coming out in the United States today, which we haven't spoken of, but there's going to be some investment, I think, in ports and other things, roads, a lot of the important aspects of infrastructure. But going back, I think customs is one of those things, digitalizing and creating more efficiency in customs systems around the world. We saw that take place during the COVID pandemic, where people erased or eliminated some of the requirements, paper-based trade still, getting the chops in Asia physically still to move goods around the world. A lot of that was suspended during COVID-19, but we're starting to see some of it creep back. And so I think when we think about digitalization, there is tremendous opportunity there at the border. And that's something that we're very focused on, particularly because we've seen low value shipments. So all this B2C has exponentially grown in the past year. It's hitting borders. It's difficult for governments to process. There's ways to digitalize it, make it faster, smarter, sharper in terms of its processing, but it's expensive. It's really, and it's not necessarily the sexiest of issues to digitalize the border, shall we say. So with that, I'll leave it there, but that would be a tremendous opportunity to increase collections, attack illegal trade, as well as to help facilitate legitimate trade to help economies around the world.
Thank you. Can I, before I go back to Barbara to summarize the digitization move, Penny, can you give us, if you can remember, an anecdote of one of your pilots, not now with the distribution of the vaccines, where they are all welcome, I imagine, but one of your pilots flying, I don't know, from London to New York, or from Beijing to the Middle East, at the peak of the coronavirus, of the pandemic. Tell us a little bit what they faced. Although it wasn't commercial, it was freight. The pilots, the crew.
Yeah, so I think it was just constantly evolving conditions. And so if you're a pilot right now, and frankly, if you're scheduling our crew at the moment, if you're a pilot can't have been, if you want to fly to Hong Kong, you couldn't have been in certain countries in the last few days. If you wanted to fly to London, you couldn't have been in certain countries in the past 14 to 21 days. That changed quickly. You couldn't have had COVID in the last 21 days. most places when you landed, you're not allowed to take a walk. So if you think about yourself when you have jet lag, many of us go try to take a walk, expose ourselves to sunlight, go have a nice meal. This is not the case. A lot of countries treat pilots, and we maintain a closed system. We try to keep our pilots, minimally exposed for their own sake as well as for the population's sake. We put them in a closed system, but they're not allowed to do any of those things at the moment. So they land, they go straight to their hotel room, they stay there, and because of scheduling, that could be several days. They're not allowed out to do anything, and then they come back and they fly. And in many cases, they're tested upon arrival, and if by chance we test them, we offer to test them when they leave their destination, and we have that option. But if they land and they had tested negative upon departure and they now test positive upon arrival, in some countries they've been put in 21-day quarantines. So they're kept away over Christmas, over holidays from their families. So and I can't speak enough to what our pilots have been doing for the past year. I just cannot speak enough for what they're doing and what I think many of us don't understand in terms of the dedication of what people have been doing to kind of get stuff around the world.
And I guess the same holds for seafarers. Barbara, let's if I can ask you on how digital tools can help relieve this incredibly bad crew change situation.
Well, I tend to agree with Chris that many of the challenges can't necessarily, at the human level, at the human interaction level, cannot really be mitigated significantly by technology. I mean, one could envision platforms and applications that collate and organize and visualize for the user all the different regulatory requirements in place so that a company can more efficiently prepare its workforce for the challenges. But at the end of the day, I think Penny is right that policymakers need to come up with some pragmatic solutions. The reality is that it's going to take quite some time to distribute vaccines to the entire global population, or at least as much as one can hope for. So this isn't going to happen. This is a situation that's going to continue for quite some time. The paper I wrote for the Atlantic Council last year also had a component that talked about the sanitization of the supply chain for this reason. Health and safety regulatory requirements are some of the most core components of government responsibility to its citizens. And that by definition makes them uniquely challenging to harmonize on a cross-border basis. This is not a digital solution. The digitization is all about efficiency. It's about decreased latency. It's about security of the supply chain. It is about decreasing the opportunity for criminal activity within the shipping system. But when we're talking about the health and safety of the populations, when we're talking about health and safety of the workers, that is something that is very difficult to implement. One can see the WTO, which by the way doesn't get enough credit for the amount of money it funnels to emerging markets to improve their technological infrastructure for customs facilitation. But I don't think the WTO or even really the Bretton Woods system is well designed to address harmonization of even emergency health measures. I know that heads of state and government recently, this week, in fact, have been calling for a pandemic treaty. They've been calling for increased agreements on vaccine distribution. I think that in a universe where we are clearly making the decision to keep the global economy open, and our citizens and our consumers are all keeping economies functioning by purchasing products, it strikes me that engaging in some kind of productive, pragmatic framework for standards related to cross-border travel, at least for essential workers in the supply chain, is eminently sensible. But I am not aware that any of such discussions are currently underway.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Let me move on to some of the questions that we have from our audience. Um, the shipping industry and the logistic chains are highly leveraged enterprises that have benefited from lower rates and the availability of capital. If they're not able to react fast on this, they could contribute to an inflation shock, right, from the supply side, that would naturally result in much higher funding costs and hurt the industry. What can be done so this logical sequence breaks? And I think that it should break. Megan, can I start with you?
Sure. So if you did get a inflation spike, I think first of all it would be temporary until these issues are sorted out. And so there are lots of different kinds of inflation. It's the kind of sustained one that causes people to think that inflation will continue spiking forever, that you really need to worry about. But for this question in particular, it's about funding costs for the industry. And it's possible that you could get a spike because there are disruptions to the industry. Should we do something about that? I actually am not sure that we should. Are there things you can do about that? Certainly. I mean, the Fed has stepped in this crisis in a way none of us could have imagined just over a year ago. So, you could get the central bank supporting a particular industry. They really don't want to do that because they don't want to be picking winners and losers, which they would be doing if this were the case. That being said, they're already picking winners and losers because if you hold what the Fed's buying, you win. So there's kind of a slippery slope there already. You could also have sort of fiscal support coming from the government for the industry in particular, which we have seen also in this crisis. The airline industry is a great example of that. I think our government gave more money to Delta Airlines than it did to childcare in this crisis, for example. So you could get the government stepping in as well. But again, I'm not sure that it's appropriate actually to have policymakers come in and address this kind of temporary shock in the market, in part because it is temporary. About a year ago, we saw oil prices going negative, and there was a lot of talk about the government stepping in to support the oil industry, which I think would have been a terrible idea, actually. And thankfully, they didn't. It could be an opportunity to kind of clear out some of the brush in the shipping industry or the transport industry without taking down the whole industry. So I actually don't know that policymakers should step in to do anything for a temporary spike like this.
Chris, how about funding for the shipping industry? The ship owners are facing some real challenges going forward. New generation of ships that will burn methanol, that will burn ammonia, or anything that does not emit CO2. This is quite a big change. We're way away from reaching that point, but there's a lot of capital that needs to come in so we can develop the new engines, that we can develop any changes in ship hulls. And a lot of banks have just pulled out of shipping. It's basically Chinese leasers that are in. And of course, this may sound a little bit like Silicon Valley, so everybody would jump on it. But it's not like this. It's still shipping loans. And shipping loans have gone very, very badly, and banks don't want to go into them. Give me your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think the first thing is the shipping industry is making very good money at the moment. You look at the earnings figures that you get from companies like Zim Shipping, Costco Shipping, who've reported just today, Hapag-Lloyd, Maersk. These guys are all making very good money at the moment, and we're seeing a spike in new vessel orders as a consequence. There's not been very much in the way of new vessel orders over the past 3 years or so. So I think last year we got to a trough that the order book for new container ships was only below 10%. I think it's around 8% of the existing fleet. That's now, if memory serves, more than doubled. And that's because there's a confidence in the industry to invest for the future. And a lot of that's been driven by the capacity and pricing discipline that the industry showed during last year. So during the downturn, during previous trade downturns, everyone's kept offering boats at any price. They've compressed returns. And of course, in 2016, Hanjin Shipping went bankrupt as a result. This time around, we had a lot of blank sailings last year, and we tracked that in our research, and I know plenty of other people have as well. And that was a sign that the shipping alliances, the big three shipping alliances, did a good job of matching supply to demand. And that's an inherent economic problem for this industry. You've got boats that you build and they last for 20, 25 years. You can only order them and get them built on a 2.5-year basis. So responding to short-term demand shocks is really complex, and that's not going to change. So the industry will go through this boom and bust cycle in terms of volumes. The trick, as always with finance, is to match your assets to your liabilities. And so it's about financing these new vessels in the right way. And that involves long-term fixed rate debt to match the commitment that you're making on the vessel purchase side, and then keeping everything else within your cost base as flexible as possible. I think what we are seeing now, though, during the current annual contract round is a lot of cargo owners asking for fixed-term, fixed-price contracts, so to try and get rid of some of this volatility. So I think there's a industry or systemic-wide attempt to reduce the inherent volatility in the shipping industry, which should make the whole thing more financeable. The big challenge, though, that the sector's facing, that actually the power generating sector that I covered many years ago went through, is facing up to decarbonisation. And certainly Maersk have said, look, we're trying to make decisions on a 20-25-year basis now when we don't know which fuels we're going to be required to use. Are we going to have to just use, as you mentioned, things like methanol or ammonia, and go carbon neutral there at the tailpipe, as it were, or the stovepipe, as it were? Or are we actually going to have to move over to something radically different, electric autonomous vehicles I talked about earlier, vessels, as I talked about earlier, or are we going to have to go back to hybrid systems, including a return to the good old days of sails, of wind power, albeit with new technologies? And I think the sooner that governments can put the framework and the rules in place for that, the better. And the more harmonized they are globally, the better. Most corporations that we speak to will say, look, we don't care what the rules are, as long as we know what the rules are, and as long as they don't change. And I think we have a real opportunity at this stage for governments to set the rules. We don't need them, to Megan's point, we don't need them to put big financing into the system. We don't need big loan backstops. We do need them to support original technology investments. That's what government does well, is broad spread funding for research and development and education in the field. It could also help if there was some money from the Biden administration's infrastructure plan for ports, particularly to adapt to some of these new technologies. But clear rules, clearly set and stuck to, are what the industry needs to ensure you get the right financing for the right vessels for the next 25 years.
Okay, thank you. We are coming close to closing the event, so let me put another question for all of you. It comes from William Janis, who's a professor at Fordham Law School. He's raised an interesting question about inflation and sourcing. What he says is, would the trade-off of higher inflation be worth it through higher wages and benefits and perhaps more social stability by insourcing and deglobalizing supply chain and producing more in the U.S. As it would support more U.S. interests and give more American more Americans work. Of course, this is just from one part of the world, but I guess the question stands for every country that is looking or envisages to deglobalize supply chains. Can I start with Penny on this?
Sure. So I would just make a comment. When we work with customers and we talk to folks about their supply chains, I would just point that reshoring or bringing all of your manufacturing back to your home country, it also creates risk. They're just different risks. And so I think going back to Megan's point that she made earlier in the presentation, it's sometimes more about diversification, just as, you know, the most resilient ecosystems in the world are those that have the largest amount of diversity in them. And I think that if you think about supply chains with sole sources of supply or things like that, that's where you really need to rethink things. So whether it's you onshoring certain things, reshoring certain things, whatever it is, I would just caution people not to kind of have this thought that by bringing everything back to your home country, you're eliminating risk, because as we know, hurricanes hit, certain other things hit supply chains in a way that doesn't necessarily eliminate risk in those cases. It just creates different and new ones. And so I think diversification in terms of resilience is a much more important thing for people to be thinking about and reviewing.
Megan, can I have your final thoughts?
Yeah, so I'm not sure that wages would naturally go up in that scenario. And I would highlight that workers are also consumers. And so you would have to, if you did assume that wages went up, you would also have to consider that so will prices. And so net, people might not be better off. I'd also just highlight that I think globalization gets a bad rap for driving inequality, and that actually I think technological advancement plays a much bigger role than many people seem to appreciate, and there's no way to stop that train, right? So even if we were to onshore, there are a whole bunch of other reasons why we continue to create low-wage, low-hour jobs, why inequality, particularly in the US, is higher than everywhere else, but continues to grow. And so I don't think that onshoring is really the answer here.
And localizing supply chains, Chris, could be, you know, an idea out there, but even localizing supply chains, local supply chains, would still use the Suez, right? So,
yeah.
It's something which I guess is a logistical process on a smaller scale through the same waters. Does this really make sense?
I think nearshoring doesn't necessarily help you. We saw some of the mismatches between opening of Mexico and the US during the pandemic and what that did to automotive supply chains. And that's pretty much as close as you can get, you know, having supply chains geographically that close together. For me, the bigger answer towards nearshoring is the use of more automation. So over the longer term, looking at where things like additive manufacturing can be used more aggressively, maybe assembly so that we're not shipping big blocks of air inside finished products around, and you know, using more local automation in that regard doesn't help jobs, unfortunately, and therefore probably not a vote winner, and therefore not necessarily something that governments can get behind. But you know, hopefully, if we're talking about this issue again in 10 years' time, it's only going to be raw materials and so on that are moving through some of these big waterways, and you know, de-risking the supply chain by going for local assembly may well have cured some of the issues.
Thank you. I want to thank.
Actually, wait. Can I just?
Barbara. Yes. Sorry.
No worries. I'll be quick though. History, especially the first half of the 20th century, history tells us that high inflation tends to increase political fragility, and highly concentrated autarkic economies tend to have in the past encouraged high concentrations of government power, which is not conducive to personal or economic freedom. The Bretton Woods system profoundly sought to break that chain and tried to create a set of incentives and a set of economic relationships that were beneficial to everyone, that would help people grow through trade and through trade, also through human interaction and engaging with each other, precisely to prevent the kinds of economic stresses and political stresses that create war. That doesn't mean it was perfect. But as the video showed at the beginning, there are components that merit continued engagement. Autarkic economies tend not to be stable, and so the fairy tale that onshoring will necessarily bring economic stability, I think, has a hard time finding factual foundation.
Thank you, Barbara. And I want to thank everyone that participated on this panel and our audience. I want to thank the Atlantic Council. It was a pleasure to be with you here today.
Costas, thank you so much. And I just want to thank everyone on this panel. Penny, Megan, Barbara, Chris, it was such a wide-ranging and important conversation to have at this moment. As you know, we planned this before the Suez situation, but I think it just brought all these issues into dramatic relief. And I want to end with something Penny said about a Bretton Woods for essential workers. One thing Suez reminded the world is that the global economy moves because of people, and that's fragile, and that can be delicate, and that can be upset, and it affects everyone. And so these are issues we are going to continue to work on here at the Atlantic Council, the GeoEconomics Center. Next week, we've talked a lot about Bretton Woods today. So next week is, of course, IMF World Bank spring meetings. We have a lot of events. You can sign up for them. We're dropping the link in our chat. And following that, we have a major event comparing US and EU economic response to the crisis. So please stay with us at the Atlantic Council, and thank you everyone for joining today.